So I think this is the last thing that we talked about, was the last interaction between organisms and a community. Remember, a community is different organisms of different species interacting with one another in the same area. And so facilitation is one species facilitating and having positive effects on another species. So an example was the black rush. The black rush is a plant that makes the soil more hospitable for the other plants that live there. And so what it actually does, we didn't write anything about this, did we?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Did we?
Yeah.
All right, okay, good. So, so it reduces evaporation, which keeps water in the soil, and this actually occurs in salt marshes, so the water is pretty salty. So keeping water in there dilutes the salt and makes it so the plants can survive there. Otherwise, if a lot of water evaporated, it'd be too salty and the plants would die. So these guys shade and reduce evaporation, so it helps other plant species indirectly. All right, and so so those are interactions. So the first section there was all about how different species interact. The second section is all about looking at two things about a community. It's diversity and how they get energy, kind of the feeding relationships are called the trophic structure. A few species in the community exert strong control on that community structure, and so species diversity and feeding relationships are two things that we're going to look at. So let's look at species diversity first. Oh, all right, let's go back. All right, so by definition, species diversity, the variety of organisms that make up the community. So how many different types of organisms? And it has two components that go into this, what we call species richness and relative abundance. So species richness is actually the number of different species in the community. And relative abundance is the proportion each species represents of the total community as a whole. So kind of like the percentage. Percentage is kind of like a proportion. And then both of these are really important because they give you information about the community. So for instance, to elaborate on that, with this diagram here, they have two forest communities labeled just Community 1 and Community 2. And so each one of these species they just gave a generic letter for, so species A, B, C, and D. So Community 1 has 4 different species, so does Community 2. Community 2 has the same 4 different species, 1, 2, 3, and 4 there. So their species richness is the same. They each have 4 different types of plants. The abundance, though, is not the same. Notice Community 1, they already did the calculations for you, but for relative abundance, you would count how many trees you have, the total community, count how many that you have of species A, so you count species A divided by the total number of trees, or the total number of species, and you get 25%. And so then they do the same thing for B, C, and D, and so this community has equal proportions of all of these species, whereas Community 2 is predominantly species A. Yes, they have species B, C, and D, but they're very far and few between. And so that tells you that abundance tells you something about that community. So overall, we wrote here that species diversity has 2 components, species richness and relative abundance. Taking in those 2 components, which community would you say is the most diverse or has the most species? Community 1. It not only has different types of species, but their composition or the proportion of those species is also diverse. If I were to ask you which one, let's say a disease came in, let's say a fungus comes in and attacks only species A. Which community has the greater effect? Does that have on? Community 2, right? Community 1 it could be affected, right? But species A is far and few between, so that fungus may or may not reach every tree here, and so there's more diversity, which then the community as a whole can rebound faster than community 1 or 2. All right. So as we just said, 2 communities can have the same species richness, but a different relative abundance. So that's the proportion. So communities that have the higher diversity, like community 1, what's true about them? They're more productive. I'll go over that in just a second. They produce more biomass, the total mass of all organisms. So bio means living, it's the matter that makes up living things. They're more stable. They're better able to withstand and recover from environmental stresses and more resistant to invasive species. So overall, they're more resistant. I want to talk about this productive thing here. This is more productive. Let's talk about what that is. The productivity is the amount of photosynthesis that goes on in the plants. Let's talk about photosynthesis. So more productive, more photosynthesis is going on. What does photosynthesis make? Glucose, right? So photosynthesis makes glucose. What does the plant do with the glucose it makes? Can store it. So let's write that here. So the glucose can be stored. What else? Yeah, used for cellular respiration. I'll just put CR for cellular respiration. So when it uses, remember glucose is the energy source, when it uses it for cellular respiration, it uses it to grow and so on, and so most of that energy is converted to heat and is lost to the environment. But the glucose that's stored, that's where it gets here, they produce more biomass. Because if you're storing glucose, if I'm a plant and absorbing sunlight energy and I'm making glucose, I use some of the glucose, but some of the glucose I'm storing in me, now I have more mass in me, so I have more biomass, all right? And so, which is just the mass of living organisms. So that's what that means. I just wanted to go over that with you. All right, so then the second thing in looking at communities, besides the diversity, is their feeding relationships, and this is called trophic structures. The feeding relationships between organisms in a community. It's a key factor in community dynamics and how the organisms interact. So the basic look at this is making what's called a food chain. Food chains link trophic levels from producers to top carnivores. Yes. Oh, I must have deleted it. You guys, there's certain things I forgot to tell you there. There's certain areas that I'm going to tell you to skip because I have 2 copies of the Fill in the Blank notes for you guys. I have the edited version, which I deleted out what you don't need to know for the AP test, and I have the non-edited, and I accidentally printed out the non-edited version. So there's going to be times where I'm going to tell you to skip things. So if I forget to do that, if the PowerPoint follows it, so just let me know and I'll tell you what to cross off. All right? I accidentally printed off the black one and didn't notice it. All right, so it's kind of fun because you're going to be able to cross off as we go through.
So the Shannon diversity index and that we can cross off?
Yes, so yeah, I forgot after the community 1 and community 2, that whole Shannon diversity index thing you don't have to know. Unless you want to know about it.
You know, this time,
Which will be your reading for tonight.
good job.
Only if you want to know about it. knock yourself out. Alright, so you're following me? Alright, yeah, I forgot about that, sorry.
That's on the.
So you are underneath diversity and stability where the communities is that first bullet underneath there. Alright, you cross off. Alright, so here we are with the food chain. So when I talk about trophic levels, that's this down the center here. These are the trophic levels. So when if a question asks you what's the trophic level of a particular organism, you're looking at where they are in the food chain. So down here we have your primary producer. Your producer is anything that does photosynthesis. I don't know why they say primary producer. Primary means first because there's really not any other kind of producer. There's not a secondary producer, but they call it primary producer. So your producers do photosynthesis. Your primary consumers are the first consumers to eat in this food chain, and so they always eat the producers. Then the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and so on and so forth. We have tertiary and quaternary, kind of the same words that we use with protein level structure as well. And so that's your trophic level. And then they give you an example of terrestrial and a marine food chain. So terrestrial meaning on land, marine meaning ocean here. And so what this is showing you is the flow of energy. So the phytoplankton here, phytoplankton is a producer. So you may have never heard of the word phytoplankton. When you are looking at a food chain, or sometimes a food web, which is many food chains put together in an ecosystem, how would I know that phytoplankton, if I've never heard of it, how do I know that it's a producer?
Does that mean photosynthesis?
Phyto does refer to light and photosynthesis, absolutely. So you can make that hypothesis. What for sure will tell you on a food chain or a food web? Yeah? That's right. It has arrows leading. Has arrows leading out to other animals, but nothing going to it, because if an organism is doing photosynthesis, it's not eating anything. So it's getting energy from the sun. So that's what we see here, and that's what we see on here. I wanted to point out as well is that the location, I don't want you to memorize the location thinking that, oh, the producers are always at the bottom, all right? That's not necessarily the case. I can make a food chain starting with phytoplankton and going left to right and so on. I can make it towards the top. So that's what you're looking for is the arrows. And so the energy is going from organism to organism, and that's the flow of energy there. And so the top carnivore here, so this whale here, do you think it only eats this one type of fish? No. So therefore, a food web shows you the more realistic model as far as what eats what in an ecosystem. So a food web is branching food chain. So it's like many food chains that show these feeding relationships and these trophic interactions. And so, whoops, that's what this picture here is showing you. So you can see here that it gets a little crazy with all the lines and so on if you look at an ecosystem and every single organism and so on. So let's look at the squid here. So here's a squid. Can somebody raise their hand and tell me a trophic level that the squid is at? Right here. Right here. Here's the squid. All right. Somebody want to raise their hand? Nathan? All right, and what's kind of the chain that you're looking at to get secondary?
I did phytoplankton, copepods, and squids.
All right, so if we look at, I'm just going to highlight this. So the phytoplankton would be your primary producer. In this case, the copepods would be your primary consumer, and then these guys here then would be a secondary consumer. Can the squids act as and have another role in terms of a different trophic level?
Phytoplankton, the krill, the fish.
So phytoplankton to krill to fish and then to the squid. If they do that, what are they? Yeah, here's primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Any others?
You can go phytoplankton to the krill, carnivorous plankton.
To the krill, to the what?
Carnivorous plankton.
Carnivorous plankton, then to the squid? Alright, so this is primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer, absolutely. And so, therefore the squid, depending upon what it's eating, it acts as, and is part of a different trophic level, so we could add quaternary consumer as well on there. And so that's what food webs do. And so altering the numbers of these organisms in the ecosystem, because sometimes we do that, we can alter the number of organisms by maybe overfishing, and so on and so forth. If you alter the number of organisms in here, it can affect many organisms as well, all right? And so therefore it can, if it's a food source for one, it can limit the organism and so on. And so that's your food web. Now, looking at a food chain, let's go back to this. Usually, you never see more than 4 or 5 links to your chain. So this one happens to be 5, sometimes it's 4. You don't see a food chain that's 10 organisms long. Can somebody give me a reason why that might be? Why don't we have 10 long? We never do, ever. Nathan?
Maybe because the more layers you have or links, the less energy is in the system.
That's right. The less energy is in the system. And so let's talk about why that is. So sunlight beams on the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton does photosynthesis. Plankton by definition is organisms in the ocean that are free floating, so they kind of go with the current. So these guys here do photosynthesis. Zooplankton are plankton that float with the current, but eat, all right? So they're not doing photosynthesis. So that's what they are. So phytoplankton absorbs the sunlight, goes through photosynthesis, makes glucose. Some of that glucose, what does it do with? We just talked about that. It stores it. So some of it's stored, but some of it's used, right, to live. That's why they make their own food in the first place, is to use it to get energy from. So what happens is when the zooplankton, guys, when the zooplankton eats the phytoplankton, the zooplankton is not getting all the energy that was originally in the sun that the phytoplankton absorbed, because some of that energy has been used through cellular respiration and so on. And so it's only getting a portion of that. And actually, it's only about 10% of the energy that's transferred from trophic level to trophic level. And so therefore, if you start out with a certain amount of energy in the phytoplankton, let's say that there's 1,000 joules of energy, then when the zooplankton eat the phytoplankton, only 10% of that is transferred, so that would be 100. And then when the carnivore eats the zooplankton, 10% of that is transferred. Does that make sense? All right, and so on and so forth. So then 1, and then we get 0.1. And that's why there's very few top carnivores. You don't have an overabundance of top carnivores in the ecosystem, because in order to get enough energy to stay alive, they have to eat they're eating up farther up the food chain. And and there's way more producers. Okay, so let's go through this. So species, as we looked at with the food web, can play a role at different trophic levels. So that's the one we just looked at, how the squid can play different roles. And food webs can be simplified by grouping species with similar trophic relationships into broad functional groups. Sometimes we look at just a portion of the community, and so instead of looking at, oftentimes with a food web, they may not take the whole ocean community and make a whole food web for it, because it can be very confusing because all the different lines, so they'll take just portions of it. And so in this particular, this is a portion of another ocean community. And so if I were to ask you what the predators of the fish larva are, you would tell me what? Predators of the fish larva. Sea nettle and the juvenile striped bass. And we know that because those are the ones that are eating the fish larva. The energy is going from the fish larva to these guys. All right? So why is there a limit? So there are limits on the food chain. They're only a few links long. This is called the energetic hypothesis. It suggests that length is limited by inefficient energy transfer. Only 10% of the energy, that's an average. Sometimes it can be a little bit more, sometimes it can be a little bit less. 10% of the energy stored in organic matter at trophic level is actually transferred to the next trophic level. So, as an example, a producer, they're using grams of biomass. So, having plant material, having 100 kilograms can only support 10% of that, which is 10 kilograms of herbivore mass, and then they can only do 1 kilogram of carnivore mass. Okay. So this is why we talked yesterday about the growing human population on the earth. With these different trophic levels, this is why if we're trying to, as a human population on earth get larger and larger and larger, and it becomes an issue to figure out how to feed everybody, it is actually more efficient to do what? To feed with plants or to feed with animals? To feed with plants, all right? Because they're lower on the food chain, there's more total energy in there. And so therefore, to feed with plants is a better way to go in having a vegetarian diet. If you think about even, also looking at space, like if you look at an herbivore like a cow, to feed people with beef, all right, you have to have a lot more space. You have to have the plants, then you have to have the area for the cows to grow, to graze, and you can fit less cows on the same area of land than you can plants, and so on. And so it's more efficient to feed with plants. So to prove that the plants kind of are the basis for productivity, researchers varied the amount of leaf litter available to consumers in a little community they call it a tree hole community. And a tree hole community is when you have a branch in a tree that dies off, it can fall off and form scar tissue. Eventually that can degrade and form a little hole in the tree, and then water can accumulate, and then microorganisms and things can live in there and so on. So you have this little community in this little hole in the tree. So they did some research with that, and they varied the leaf litter, which is the leaves, which is the producer part. So it's the bottom of the food chain, the beginning of the food chain. And so, so they had the high, medium, and low amount of leaf litter, and then they measured the number of trophic level links, and they found that the more producers you have, then it can support, because you have more energy at that base, then it can support more links, all right? Because remember that it goes down 10% as you go up the food chain. All right, so that is your feeding relationships and trophic levels. So hopefully you remember food chains and food webs. You remember that? Usually people remember that from biology and sometimes food chains you do in elementary school, right? Yes. All right, good. So another thing to look at in communities is the impact certain species have. Some species have a huge impact on the community as a whole. Some species are really abundant, so there's lots of them. And some species aren't very abundant, but have some kind of a role that really affects the community. And so we're gonna look at two different examples of that. So let's look at when a species is highly abundant. They call that a dominant species. So a dominant species are those that are most abundant or have the highest biomass. One hypothesis suggests that dominant species are most competitive in exploiting resources. So they're the best at getting resources, that's why they're so abundant, and therefore are the dominant species. Another hypothesis is that they're most successful at avoiding predators, and so then they're able to survive and become more abundant. Invasive species, remember, which are transported usually by humans, may become dominant because of their lack of predators and so on. So they can take over an ecosystem, as we've talked about before. So how do we study the impact of the dominant species? So one way to discover the impact of a dominant species is to remove it from the community. So it's kind of unrealistic to actually go to a community and say, we're gonna remove every single one of these organisms out. And so oftentimes what we do is we look at what happens when something naturally takes out the dominant species. And this happened here in North America with the chestnut tree. The Chestnut Blight, this was a fungus, this was a fungal infection that affected the chestnut trees. And so notice here the chestnut trees, it says, killed most of the dominant American chestnut trees. So that implies that they were most abundant. So there were tons of chestnut trees. This fungus came in and killed off all the chestnut trees. That was the dominant species. So then they looked to say, okay, what is going to happen as a result of this, to kind of see what that species' role was and the impact it had on the community as a whole. What they found is those chestnut trees, when they were wiped out, it didn't have a negative effect on the other trees. In fact, other trees in the community began to grow. They began to reproduce, and there became more of them. Why does that make sense?
There's less, there's, kind of is it species less relative abundance, so that other species can grow more. There's a gap or a void in there, so obviously other trees at that bottom we're going to fill that up.
Okay, and they can fill that up because there's more space, less competition for resources, so they have more resources at their available to them, and so they can use those resources, whereas the chestnut tree was taking those resources before. So they found that the chestnut trees kind of were limiting the growth maybe of the other trees. But then they also found, as part of the community, animals and plants live there, and then as a result of the disappearance of the chestnut trees, actually 7 moth and butterfly species actually went extinct. They're no longer even around. And so why is that? Because their food, they were dependent on the chestnut tree for food. It was basically their sole food source, and therefore became extinct. So this dominant species had an effect on this community by keeping the other trees kind of at bay and check, and then also providing food for other species. And so we can see their role based upon when they're gone. Unfortunately, they had to be gone to look at that. All right, the second way that a species can have an effect is not as a dominant species, but as what we call a keystone species. This species has very strong control over the community by their role in the community. So they necessarily aren't abundant in the community. And so sea stars are an example of this, so starfish. Here's a picture of a starfish. Let me talk about the starfish here. The starfish in this community, its main diet is mussels. Mussels are a bivalve, so they open and close and they have the fleshy organism inside. So that's what all these are a bunch of mussels. And this is the starfish preying on the mussels. So how a starfish does that? Starfish on its arms at the bottom of them have little things they call them tube feet. They're kind of like little suction cups a little bit. And what they do is they put their arms around this bivalve, and the 2 feet stick to the shell, and they pry open the mussel. So, and they open it in such a way that the opening is towards the middle of them, because underneath here on the underside, they have a little opening. It's their only opening into and out of them. And so then what they do is they exude this little sac into the bivalve, and which then releases enzymes that digest the fleshy part of the mussels, and then they absorb the nutrients, and then they're done with it and they leave the shell, and that's how they get their nutrients from there. All right, so they're quite a little predator there, the sea stars. So they have a lot going on here. So that's what this guy is doing here, is getting dinner here. So then what we want to look at here, they did an experiment where they want the sea stars, there's not very many of them, but their main diet, as I said, is these mussels. So they did an experiment over time here, so you can see year by year. And in this intertidal community, they looked at one with Pisaster as the name of a type of sea star. And with the sea star, you can see what they're measuring over time is the number of species present. And with the sea star, that seems to remain high. In intertidal communities where they remove the sea star so that there are not sea stars, you can see a dramatic decline in the species diversity in that community. Can somebody explain why and what's happening? Why is the diversity staying up with the sea star but drop without the sea star? An idea? Liam?
So I think there's 2 reasons. Number one, you can have species that prey on the sea star itself, so you're taking that out of the equation, and they don't have a primary food source. And then the other thing is, without the sea star, the mussels will begin to accumulate more and more because they don't have a predator that can overcompete other species at that level.
Yes, absolutely. Both of those things are going on here. So we get this decline in the species. And so therefore, the sea star is considered a keystone species, not because there's a lot of them, but they play a pivotal role in the keeping the diversity and the community intact. So by eating the mussels and keeping the diversity high. And so you take that out and we get almost a collapse of the community as a result of that. And so that's a keystone species. So very important species as a result of their role. Some organisms can actually have an impact on the community based upon changing the natural environment. This is the ecosystem engineer. And they cause physical change in the environment that can affect the community structure. So an example I have here is beaver dams can transform a landscape. So here's a beaver, all right, a couple beavers. All right, so can somebody tell me how a beaver dam can transform a landscape? Roman?
Might also isolate fish from one side.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you can see here, we said the dam blocks the flow of water, and so it can change the flow of water, can change the direction of the stream or river, or cause water to pool up, so you get small ponds and things like that. It also can keep organisms separated on either side of the dam so that they're not able to interbreed. Absolutely. Alrighty. Then as we look at communities, communities can be disturbed. And they used to think that communities were in this delicate balance. Oh yes, I forgot. This is another area where you skip. Alright, so you get to skip quite a bit here. Alright, you get to go up to 53.3. Told you it's exciting, exciting times. So they used to think, as I said, that communities are in the state of equilibrium with all the organisms and so on, this delicate balance. And this guy named Clement suggested that the interactions between living things, that biotic interactions cause species in a climax community that's a very mature community, kind of function as a superorganism in this delicate balance with one another. We've learned that ecosystems really aren't in this equilibrium, in a state of equilibrium. They're actually kind of always in flux in responding to disturbances. So some other ecologists says, no, we don't think that that's right. They challenged whether communities were at equilibrium, that communities are just chance assemblages of organisms that live together. Why do they live together? Because they are able to survive with the same requirements. They have similar abiotic requirements, like if it's a plant species, the soil. So like plants in the desert have in common that they are able to grow in the sand. They're able to live in warm temperatures and have adaptations for that with rainfall and so on. So they have similar abiotic requirements. And so, so realistically, communities have disturbances. By definition, a disturbance is an event that changes a community. It can change it by removing organisms from it, or altering resource availability. It changes it in some way. So now the recent emphasis on the role of change has produced what we call a non-equilibrium model, which describes communities as constantly changing after disturbances. So that there's constantly some disturbances going on, and so communities are in this constant flux in responding to that. So an example of a community that is can respond to a disturbance. On this, I don't have, when we look at this, I'm going to go through Yellowstone National Park. All right, so you have, when we look at here, the non-equilibrium model. Then it says characterizing disturbances. You're going to cross that out. All right, so you don't need to know that. Again, fun stuff. And then you can cross out through the little picture there with the graph. But then look at the bullet here, large scale in the Yellowstone National Park in 1988. That's this. All right. The Yellowstone forest is an example of what we call a non-equilibrium community. And so it responds to massive disturbances, and actually massive disturbances like fires are actually instrumental for plants in Yellowstone Park. Let me show you here. Here is right after the fire, so you can see the damage done, and this is 1 year after the fire, so it's starting to recover. And why fire for the plants in Yellowstone community is a natural part of the life cycle. The main dominant tree species in Yellowstone Park is a type of pine tree called Lodgepole Pine. And this pine tree has pine cones. And so when we look at pine cones, the pine cones can open, so they're closed as they're developing, and then they open up, and when a pine cone opens up like this, so this is I'm not a very good artist here, but you know what I'm talking about with the pine cone, right? All right. The inside here are seeds, which remember are baby plants for the tree. And the thing is, for the lodgepole pine in Yellowstone, is what triggers the pine cone to open is heat from fire, all right? And so what happens is, fire is a natural part of the life cycle of this plant. So what happens is, on the forest floor, usually this happens with naturally, like through lightning, natural fires can cause the start of a fire, and so you have maybe brush on the bottom of the forest floor that catches on fire. So it's burning, creating heat. The pine cones up here, that heat reaches them, they open up. The seeds then can spread, all right, so they go through the air and so on and land. The fire eventually goes out, so you can see here that the big trees even have burned down, but they've already spread their seeds. Their seeds now are on the ground. All of this burnt material adds nutrients to the soil, so now the soil becomes really nutrient rich, and all these little seeds then sprout up, and what you end up getting is new lodgepole pines growing into the area. And therefore, these new ones have all the resources. They have nutrient-rich soil. There's none of the big trees anymore because they've been burned down, so there's no competition for sunlight. And all these little trees then can grow up, and then they replenish the population, and that cycle continues over and over again. So therefore, fires in some ecosystems are a natural part of the ecosystem and the community. And so that's why it's a non-equilibrium community. It can change, and therefore this is 1 year after the fire, and given time, it'll eventually look, I wish I had a picture of the before here, it'll eventually look and be covered with the lodgepole pines that like it did before over time as these guys grow and so on. And so that's actually an example of what we call succession, which is when a disturbance happens to a community and it kind of rebounds from that. All right, and so that's the Yellowstone disturbance. So speaking of disturbances, this flows right into succession. A sequence of community changes after a disturbance. So we saw 1 year after the disturbance, and so you could document it for many years and look at the changes. There are two kinds of succession. So it's what we call primary and secondary succession. Primary succession is basically when the primary means first, right? So it's kind of like the very first organisms to live in an area. So what does that mean? Like primary succession, an example of that is a receding glacier. So when the glacier pulls back, you expose this ground, nothing's growing on that ground, all right? So there's no plants and things like that. But given time, eventually plants will come in. They usually are small plants at first, and then they're larger and larger and larger until you get what's called the established climax community. So that's an example of primary succession. Secondary succession, is when you have an area of land that a disturbance has happened, that you had organisms living there, a disturbance happens, and then you replace those organisms. So that's like the fire example of Yellowstone. There was a forest there, it burns down, and then it replenishes itself, and that would be secondary. So let's look at primary succession, where no soil exists. So early arriving species and later arriving species may be linked in one of three processes. So the first species that get there and the last species. Early arrivals may facilitate the appearance of later species by making the environment favorable, or they may inhibit the establishment of later species, or really have no effect. They can tolerate the later species but have no impact on their establishment. So they can have either positive, negative, or neutral effect on what comes later. So let's look at some examples of this. We're going to look at, I used the example of a retreating glacier, and they actually studied a retreating glacier in Glacier Bay, Alaska. So it follows a predictable pattern of change in both vegetation, plant life, and soil characteristics. First, plants will be the first ones to come in, then animals will follow because animals feed off the plants. And so the type of plants kind of determine the type of animals. I'm going to have you add here, so this is step number one. Step number one here says it's colonized by pioneering species. Sometimes they call the first plants there the pioneer species. That's what they'll say. So you need to know that when they see the word pioneer species, it means the first plant, in this case, that gets to the area exposed by the retreating glacier. One other example of an organism that is a pioneer species that I want you to be familiar with is something called a lichen. get to that. This is what a lichen looks like. This is what lichen looks like. We have lichen, you probably have seen it here in Michigan. It can be on trees, barks of trees, rocks, and things like that. We have it all over the place here. So lichen, why it's often a pioneer species, this is attached to rock. It actually can grow without soil. And so it actually can, as it grows into cracks and crevices in the rock, it can actually break up the rock. And so it breaks it up into pebbles and gravel and so on, and over time eventually creates topsoil for the newly exposed land from the receding glacier. And so that's why it's instrumental to actually make the soil. And then when they die, they have organic, it's organic material that living things are made up of. And so when they die and decompose, they add nutrients to the soil. And now the soil, you're getting soil that's nutrient rich. The more nutrients in the soil, then you can support bigger plants. And so then, there's Glacier Bay here. So here's our pioneer stage. Where we get small organisms helping to create and make it more hospitable by creating soil and nutrient-rich soil for bigger plants. So here we have the driest stage where we have a little bit bigger plants. Sometimes we get shrubs and so on in there. Then we get some trees, and eventually we get even larger trees. And this is what actually happened in Glacier Bay, and so you get your spruces at the end. So step 2, that picture that we just looked at, the driest is a little bit bigger plant. It will dominate. And then the elder invades and forms dense thickets, and then we get our larger trees. The elder are overgrown, and therefore they don't get enough sunlight by the larger trees, the spruce, the hemlocks, and so on. And so that's kind of the pattern of succession. The type of species varies. This just is what happened in Glacier Bay, but overall we go from smaller to larger plants. And let's look at why that is. So succession is the result of changes induced by the vegetation itself. So those small plant species, those pioneer plant species, facilitate later arrivals. Like why a big tree can come and live there in the first place is because it increases soil nitrogen. Soil nitrogen. All living things need a source of nitrogen. Plants, us, and so on. I'm going to ask you to refer way back towards the beginning of the year. Anybody remember what organisms use nitrogen to build? What other molecules? Molecules they use that contain nitrogen. All right, amino acids, which comprise proteins, right, are used to build proteins. So plants, let's think about us. How do we get our nitrogen to build proteins? We eat it, all right? We eat it. We cannot there is nitrogen in the form of N2 in the air, and every time we inhale, we take in that nitrogen, but we exhale it right back out. We can't use it from the atmosphere. And so we have to get our nitrogen through our diet. So we eat a plant or an animal. And so here's our plant. Can plants eat? No. So they can't eat their amino acids and eat their nitrogen. So where do they get it? They get it from the soil. So plants through the roots not only take in water, they take in nitrogen. That nitrogen actually gets into the soil from there's bacteria in the soil that take nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they take it and convert it into a usable form that then plants can take in and use. And then plants can build their proteins. We can eat the plants or eat something that ate the plants, and therefore we have this flow of nitrogen. You're good? All right. So proteins are one thing that we use nitrogen to build. What's the second molecule that nitrogen is found in? Nucleotides, DNA. All right, absolutely. And so the plants get their nitrogen to build that as well. Question?
So for carnivorous plants, like pitcher plants and Venus flytraps, aren't they carnivorous because the soil is low in nitrogen?
Yes.
And they use that as a
And they
supplement?
get nitrogen from the, like a fly or whatever.
Insects or whatever they kill?
Yes, absolutely. Alright, so these guys are used to build, let's put nucleic acids. And protein. And that's why the soil nitrogen content's important. So this is why we fertilize. Alright, so you fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers contain a source of nitrogen. We're gonna learn also that another thing that's important is phosphorus. They also contain a source of phosphorus. And so when we fertilize our lawn or gardens or things like that, we're putting in sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. Organic material does the same thing. So some people will do composting, where they'll take dead or organic material, plant material, and let it decompose, and then it forms and you put that into your soil. And it's the same idea. You're just putting nitrogen and phosphorus back into your soil in a natural way, composting, and versus a synthetic way with our fertilizers. All right, so. And so this, I think, is where I'll stop here. We're almost done. All right. So.
Yes.